Hey everyone, welcome to Book Squirrel. I am Robbie, and in today's video, I am going to be doing a DNF review of Stephen King's It. Da-da-da, ba-ba-bum, Book Squirrel. I don't know. Stephen King's It is a horror novel that was originally published in 1986. I have the first Scribner trade paperback edition that was published in 2016. It is a standalone novel and runs approximately 1,153 pages in length. Unfortunately, of those pages, I only got through 410, which is still a lot, before I decided that I was going to just be done and not continue reading. However, like I do in all of my reviews, I am going to be breaking this book down using my ACORN system, which looks at the book's approach, characters, offerings, readability, and narration. I'm going to be giving you my thoughts of what I did read, but I'm also going to be supplementing those categories with other reviews from users on Storygraph. So without further ado, let's get to the acorns. Approach. All right, let's begin with the blurb. To the children, the town was their whole world. To the adults, knowing better, Derry, Maine was just their hometown, familiar, well-ordered, a good place to live. It was the children who saw and felt what made Derry so horribly different. In the storm drains, in the sewers, it lurked, taking on the shape of every nightmare, each person's deepest dread. Sometimes it reached up, seizing, tearing, killing. The adults, knowing better, knew nothing. Time passed, and the children grew up, moved away. The horror of it was deep buried, wrapped in forgetfulness, until the grown-up children were called back, needing to confront it once more as this ancient terror stirred and coiled in the sullen depths of their memories, reaching up again to make their past nightmares a terrible present reality. So, as someone who has seen the miniseries multiple times, as well as the newer movies that came out in 2017 and 2019, the blurb is exactly what I would expect, and it matches my understanding of the story as it exists in those other formats. I do find it really interesting how this blurb is so high level, though, and leaves all of the finer details of the story completely up to those who want to delve within its pages. But given how well known this title is, how much clout exists around this book already, I'm sure it doesn't really have to do a whole lot to begin with to entice its readers to pick it up. As far as the cover goes, I think this is a very straightforward cover. You still get the aspect of the clown, and I do kind of love that it's a clown white background to really drive home that idea. And while I do find the cover to do the job, at the same time, I kind of find it a little boring. As I typically do in my reviews, especially of older books, I research the other covers that have been released in the past, and I would honestly say that a lot of the covers are pretty basic. The covers that did draw me into it the most were the ones that were hinting at the sewer drain, and there were quite a few different illustrations that kind of gave either an 80s vibe or just hinted to something hidden in the drain that I did really like. And one other thing that I thought was really interesting with the covers is this book was actually split into a trilogy in a French version that had the most absurd covers that I kind of loved. They were very campy, and when put together, they actually created a tableau of various scenes from the book, which I thought were really cool. Prior to starting this book, I have read 5 other Stephen King books. Only one other of those is on my channel, but I felt somewhat familiar with Stephen King's writing, and I was pretty certain that I was going to enjoy this book. I was ready to conquer the marathon that is this book at a relatively brisk but safe pace. I was ready to be scared. I was ready to have some really crazy things happen, but ultimately I wasn't that excited to be reading such a big book. So overall, I gave It by Stephen King a 4 out of 5 acorns in approach. Given this is a DNF review, though, those are the only acorns that I'm going to be giving because I don't give acorns for the other categories since I did not finish the book. Characters. Even though I didn't finish the book, I do have a few notes when it comes to characters. For me, the name soup in this book is real, and I found it to be a bit of a problem. Pretty much every single person that is mentioned is going to be given a name, a first and a last name, sometimes a nickname, sometimes multiple nicknames, and I just found it to be hard to keep track of at times. And here is a quote that I think lends well to that idea. Garton would later tell officers Hughes and Conley that he was pretty sure Mellon was high on something. So he was, Haggerty would agree, when this idea was passed on to him by officers Gardner and Reeves. That's just 2 sentences, and there are 7 names there. And it didn't help that these characters were regularly being referenced by sometimes just their first name, sometimes their last name, sometimes one of their nicknames. This bouncing back and forth made my head spin a couple of times when it came to just keeping track of people. Even within the core group of people, it was like Richie and Eddie and Ben and Bill. And once you read 1,000 pages, I'm sure you've got every single one of them down. But it was taking me way longer than I was expecting to keep track of these characters. And I frankly think the main reason is because most of these characters are fairly two-dimensional. They're either split into not bullies or bullies, and the kids who aren't bullies are really only provided like a singular characteristic. One has a stutter, one makes a lot of voices, and in worst case scenarios, their singular trait is defined by just how they exist. One kid's the fat kid, one kid's the girl. And so I found a lot of these characters to just not be very fleshed out. Like, we got a lot of backstory, we got a lot of information surrounding the households these kids grew up in and various things surrounding the kids, but the kids themselves, in my opinion, were all fairly the same. I found the character of It to ultimately be the most intriguing character in this book, which makes a lot of sense given its nature is very mysterious and it shows up many different times in many different ways. And to me, that was the meat of this book, the reason why I picked this up, the reason why I wanted to get to it, where the chills were, where the scares were. And in those scenes where It was present, they went by really fast. The scenes were incredibly short-lived. It as a monster was incredibly ineffective, which almost completely took away the fear factor of the monster, in my opinion. And also its appearances became incredibly repetitive. It would pop up, usually in a different form, scare some kids, the kids would run away, the end. And so the payoffs didn't even feel that rewarding when It was around. And that's really just the 400 pages that I read. But let's see what some reviewers on Storygraph had to say about this, shall we? All right, here is a 3.5 star review from Julia Elrod. They say, I didn't expect the book to be so character focused, and I loved that aspect. King devotes long sections to each character's backstory, so we come to understand them all intimately. And I would definitely agree with this. As I mentioned, we do get a lot of information about all of the context surrounding each of the main characters. I just found the characters themselves to be fairly two-dimensional as far as their personality and psychology goes. Here is a 3-star review from RJ Booktown. They say, it was good, but man, I have big problems with the way the women were written. Completely agree. I really strongly disliked a lot of the character representations in this book, but I'm saving some of that discussion for the other categories because it plays a big role in a couple things for me. Here is a 2-star review from Boo There It Is, which I love that name. They say, King subjects his characters to such sadism, but not in a way that evokes fear. Instead, the overwhelming sense is pity for the characters, which is remarkable considering how unlikable, superficial a lot of them are written. And honestly, I totally agree with that. Here's another review, 4.25 stars from Liv88. They write, I like how most of the characters were not perfect on purpose, even the most lovable characters. I didn't like that Bev was very over-sexualized, which got annoying. I do wish there was more character development with her to show a stronger female main character. I completely agree with that as well. And then here's a comment about the monster by Nat-tastic. They gave it 4 stars and said, I can say that I found the monster delightfully unique. The characters were likable enough, though they struggle with the fact that this was written in a different time. A lot of Richie's voices are very racist, and there is the one wildly problematic chapter near the end. Ooh, we'll get to that later. I think we understand who the characters are, even though they are two-dimensional. Those 2 dimensions are recognizable. You just need to be able to sort out the names of who is who. So I do agree that there's a lot of backstory provided and some context. I didn't find these characters to be as deep or believable as I would have liked them to be, frankly. Offerings. I wanted this book to be a scare. I wanted to be frightened. I remember seeing the It miniseries when I was way too young to I probably should not have watched it when I did. It scared the crap out of me. It made me scared of showers. It made me scared of sewer pipes. I just found so much of it to be very spooky. Watching it again as an adult, yeah, I mean, it is scary, but I think the movies are much more successful in that way. I think we need a lot more shock factor, and the movies really deliver that, in my opinion. So I was expecting something very similar like that with the book. But when it comes to the offerings that the book actually gives you, yeah, you do get some moments with it. From what I read, it is there, but just not in a way that I found to be very scary. The themes that are there, I would definitely say that there's an aspect of just kids being kids. It's like a group of kids that are all banding together, and that is kind of cute in a way. I just didn't really relate to many of the kids. Maybe that's because I wasn't a kid in the mid-1900s, but it does provide a flashback to that time period that I think a lot of older readers or people who naturally like that time period will gravitate towards. I just didn't really care too much about that. It didn't really do anything for me. And unfortunately, the other theme apart from that was just a lot of cruelty. Where I was hoping for scares, in return, I really got just a lot of people being very mean to each other, very hostile, just very cruel. There's an unignorable amount of homophobia in this book, of misogyny, of racism, of domestic violence, of physical harassment. It's constant. And pretty much none of this actually comes from the monster. It's all about how people are treating each other, how parents are treating their children, how kids are treating each other. And so the big offering that I found here, at least in the first third of this book, is just existing through a lot of people being abused in various ways, socially, physically, culturally, and I got so tired of that. But let's see what the people say on Storygraph, shall we? Here is a 4-star review from Max Libris. They say, I almost reduced my rating to 3.5, and the reason for it is rooted in how King portrays mothers, gay people. I really hate the beginning of the movie It Chapter 2. Racism and adolescence. They say spoiler ahead, and I don't really think this is a spoiler. It does happen towards the end of the book. It's not in either of the miniseries or the movies for good reason, and it frankly has so little impact on the actual story itself. It's to me just a disgusting scene. But they say, I don't think it was necessary to have a bunch of 11-year-old boys have sex with an 11-year-old girl, and I completely agree with that. I mean, I didn't even get to that part, but when I did go on to the Wikipedia to finish reading the plot, it's written out right there. At one point, they get lost in the sewers. For some inexplicable reason, the solution to this is that the girl needs to have sex with every single one of the boys. Why is that necessary? I didn't even get to that part, and yet I'm not surprised, because even in the amount that I read, there were so many times where Stephen King was just reflecting on people's genitals, reflecting on the one girl's body changing from puberty. I mean, it was just like, how much of this do we really need in this story, to be honest? Here is a 4.25-star review from Clay Werner. They say, at times, it's a deep and introspective look at childhood and the passage to adulthood and how we deal with or choose not to, and forget our childhood traumas, and how those we hold closest can help us do so. They say it's a great blend of terror, humor, and love. Here's a 5-star review from Jennifer P., who says, well, that was something. A good summer read. As another reviewer put it, it's a book about children, and for children, summer lasts forever. This book goes on, just like there is all the time in summer. This might be a good summer read for you if you want. I don't know. I will frankly never be picking this book up again. So all in all, I really honestly think that the offerings of this book are really going to depend on who you are as a person. For me, I wanted to read a scary book. I personally didn't find this book to be scary. Some people did. I think if you know the movies, you might be spoiled for what's ahead. If you don't know this story at all, I think then maybe this book will be really interesting for you. If you are someone who likes the 50s and 60s and a summer group that is primarily boys, well, then maybe you'll like this book as well. I will say that there are some really interesting chapters in this book regarding the history of the town, and I did like that. I did like the feeling of being in the town. There are maps online that you can look up while you're reading to kind of follow the kids through the town. That was an interesting experience, but frankly, in the end, I just did not find the offerings that were being presented to me worth the hassle of reading this massive book. Readability. This book is almost 1,200 pages. That, to me, is almost inaccessible for a book. There's enough material in this book that, frankly, I think it would have made a lot more sense for it to be split into 2 parts. Very similar to how the movies are split into 2 parts, very similar to how the miniseries was split into 2 parts. Because really, in my opinion, there are 2 stories at play here. But when you put it all together into one book, this massive, massive mountain of a novel, I think that makes it very inaccessible. If my wheel hadn't spun this book and said you are going to read this right now, I don't think I ever would have wanted to pick up this book, even though I had thought that I was going to really like it, simply because of how big it is. I think that the language is relatively accessible. Similar to a lot of Stephen King's older works, there are a lot of popular references that give this book a very dated feel, and a lot of references that if you just don't know them, you're either going to have to just skip them and say, well, I don't know what that is, or just stop pretty regularly to look them up, which I think is fun to a degree, but at the same time, I just was not interested enough to go down those rabbit holes. And on top of that, there are a lot of slurs, and the slurs just get more and more as the story progresses. And when it comes to the content warnings, I think they're all here. I think every single one of them is here, and I feel like I already covered a lot of them in the previous section. So frankly, I found the readability in this book to be pretty horrible, because I feel like to read this book, you really, really, really have to put aside any kind of social awareness that you have, any kind of social sensitivity that you have to people being discriminated against, marginalized. Even the bullying in this book is intense. Very early on in the book, someone is literally carved into. It's just there for the shock value, really, and not really for the actual realistic repercussions of what that would actually do. Going to the Storygraph reviews, here's a 4-star review from Sid DVM. They say, lots of things that could have, should have been removed and made it shorter, but very well written and very good ending. I agree that this book really should have been shorter. Here is a 4-star review from Kay Mallory. Wow, I forgot just how long this novel is. I know I enjoyed it the first time I read it way back when, but I don't think that it aged well. Things that weren't quite as shocking to me the first time around really made me cringe in this reading. The casual homophobia, the rampant racism, underage sex, yikes, totally cringeworthy. This story itself could have been shortened by about 500 pages, but it was still creepy and disturbing. Completely agree with all that. Here is a 5-star review from Tess CCC. They say, it was a chore to finish this book. I picked it up and put it down many times over several months. It's heavy and hard to read physically and mentally, but it's real and raw and explores the side of humanity we don't always want to look at. But I also want to point out that it doesn't necessarily explore humanity. It explores a man's fictional perspective of what life is. To be a kid in the 50s must have been the absolute worst thing ever, according to this book. And I don't even know if that's realistic. And here's a 3-star review from Elsia Brooke, who says, I feel like I myself took on Pennywise with how Herculean it was to finish this behemoth of a novel. They say, in all honesty, the movies and shows are so much better than the book, and I think that is a first for me. They flat out say, if you're interested in reading it, just don't. Look up the Spark Notes and just watch the media for it. And frankly, that's where I'm at too. I'm so surprised by how disappointed I was in this book, and now having read what I have read and know what I know about the actual text of this book, I feel gross when it comes to this story now. And here's a 2-star review from Jesse3Books, who says, damn, this took so long to read. I'm no stranger to a long book, but this story didn't justify its page count to me. So in terms of readability, I think you're really going to have to push through a lot of discomfort, and be really prepared for a marathon of frustration and abuse, especially if you're anybody who's marginalized. And to the A to the R-R-ation, narration. A lot of what's already been said can really be applied to the narration here, but some more specific things regarding the way the story is structured. I found that I liked a lot of Stephen King's prose. That's not new for me. The way the book started off instantly, I was so excited. I was so ready. Right away, the first line of the entire book says, the terror, which would not end for another 28 years, if it ever did end, began, so far as I know or can tell, with a boat made from a sheet of newspaper floating down a gutter swollen with rain. And I was in it. I was so ready to love this book. And then the first chapter again, we have he did not even like opening the door to flick on the light because he always had the idea this was so exquisitely stupid he didn't dare tell anyone, that while he was feeling for the light switch, some horrible clawed paw would settle lightly over his wrist and then jerk him down into the darkness that smelled of dirt and wet and dim rotted vegetables. I give it to Stephen King. He's really good at writing some pretty epic sentences. I loved so much of those little moments. And even though I only read a third of this book, there were plenty of moments that I thought I really like what he says right there. But when it comes to the structure of this book, it starts off with that quintessential scene of Georgie at the storm drain with his paper boat and it going down one of the storm drains and Pennywise popping up and trying to entice him to reach into the storm drain. And I find that scene to be one of the most rewarding in the book, at least of what I read. But then it immediately switches over to the entire homophobic section of the book, where you're literally having to read in many different details about how much people just hate that gay people exist in their town and want to kill them. And that was a bit of a struggle, but I pushed past. And then you just get a lot of repetitive stuff over and over and over and over again after that. Every single one of the kids that is affected in the first half of this book, you watch every single one of them getting their phone call as adults saying, by the way, it's happening again. And you watch the same beats happen every single time, the terror that comes back to them, their loved ones being confused. What was that phone call about? Why do you have to leave? Where are you going? Tell me what's happening. And then them getting into some kind of transit. You're getting the same beats of, remember that one summer when kids went missing and we each started to have our own individual encounters with some scary clown? It became so repetitive. And on top of that, it was flashback upon flashback upon flashback. It was tangent upon tangent upon tangent. A kid would think about something and then you'd get 3 pages of that thing they were thinking about. And in the middle of those 3 pages, you probably also got a flashback about some other tangent that they were reminded of during their flashback. There was so much extra information in the storytelling of this book. And honestly, going back to a lot of the things that have already been said, I personally find it to be problematic. If you are someone who is straight, maybe you're not the best person to be telling the story of what it is like to be gay. If you are a man, maybe you're not the best person to be telling the story of what it's like to be female. Same with white authors telling the stories of black people, and so on and so on and so on and so on. And Stephen King, who is none of these things, takes it upon himself to use their suffering as a means to establish conflict. And I find that to be problematic. And if you are someone who is going to be capitalizing on the struggles and the suffering of other people, I think we currently have enough of a social awareness in this day and age to at least say that you need to be sensitive. And there's zero sign that he was sensitive about any of these struggles. Sure, the woman might beat up her abusive husband in the end, and you might get that nice sense of revenge. Sure, the people who are responsible for the gay people getting killed might end up getting convicted and going to jail. And yet there's so much of the hateful perspective given the light here. Most of the story regarding the homophobia is not told from the gay person's perspective. The gay person opens their mouth and the cops interviewing him want to teach him a lesson or two. And most of the perspective is actually from the people who hate the gay person. They're the ones that are given the biggest voice and the biggest spotlight here, even if justice is somehow served in the end. And the very first time you meet the female character in this book, it's over 100 pages in, and it's told from the perspective of her abusive husband. The phone rings, it wakes him up, he hears her voice, and to him, her voice is so shrill, it makes him want to beat her. Excuse me? This is the first time we're really being introduced to the female main character, and it's through that lens? I just find it to be so distasteful. I just find it to completely lack any type of social awareness. And I get that this was written in the 80s, but come on. Our species has been around long enough. We have an understanding of social awareness. We've had many periods throughout human history where we've come together and realized that maybe we shouldn't be othering people in that way. We've already gone to war for some of these ideals, right? And so I just find there to be very, very little excuse in this, especially since this story is supposed to surround one of the most interesting monsters. That's all the material you really should have to need. And instead, there's this this choice to constantly focus on the struggling of the other, of the fat person, of the Jewish person, of the female, of the black person, of the gay person. And I definitely claim ownership for the fact that I am sensitive to these things and that I just found this to be an unlikable read in so many different ways, that it really cast a storm cloud over the good moments that I do recognize are in this book. Here is a 2-star review from Amelia Mayhen that says, "Oh, Stephen, if only you had a good editor who would encourage you to cut all of the unnecessary fat along with all of the vulgarities that pop up on almost all of your books, including this one. I don't need to know the status of his erection or her nipples or that someone has now wet their pants. I like many of Stephen King's novels, but I always have to roll my eyes since he apparently just can't help himself." Here's another 2-star review from DB603. "This book is the equivalent of throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what sticks. I mean, it spans everything from werewolves to children's fears, to folk horror, to racism, to abuse, to bodily horror, to supernatural horror, to aliens. Literally everything is thrown into this book. Some of it works and some of it doesn't." Going back to the 5-star review from Jennifer P. She says, "I love the way the story was constructed, the timelines, the chapter titles, the plot, the town." They also say, "I do have to say that I feel like King goes way off the rails near the end there. There was no purpose, no reason, no reality, and no redeeming quality for that business." And I can only assume they're talking about the underage sex scene. Here is a 3-star review from Blue Line Swinger that says, "He didn't need to include like 200 years of lore about this monster town, and he really didn't need to include 110 pages of exposition about the characters' adult lives leading up to the book. And he really, really, really didn't need to include the graphic, meticulously detailed sex scene between 7 middle schoolers." And I really agree with their final comment here where they say there's such a great little pearl of a book buried beneath all the bloat. I completely agree with that. And then one last review, a 3-star review from Ink and Elixirs. They say, "I found myself comparing it too much to the movie. Yes, I somewhat liked the movies, but found myself not as entertained too much with the book. There were many aspects I wanted more details of, while so many details of scenes I felt were unnecessary." And I really think that all of this speaks to the idea that the narration did have a lot of details, but I don't personally feel like a lot of those details were really necessary, and some of them are harmful. And some of them are inappropriate. But again, that's my perspective on this book. Obviously, there were plenty of people who gave this review a lot of stars. Some people who gave some stars because they do acknowledge that the movies are good, and without the book, these movies wouldn't exist. And I agree with that. I mean, the reason why I was drawn to this book was because I really liked the movies. I think I'll just probably stick to those media from now on when it comes to this book. Bam, 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 summary. Summary, bam, 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 summary. In summary, I am so disappointed with my experience with this book. I was so ready to do the marathon. I was so ready to take a good chunk of my life in reading this book and come out the other side saying, I did it, and I'm so glad I did. But I'm really more glad in retrospect that I've put the book down. And when I first started to look at the reviews, because that's always the first thing I do when I'm thinking I'm going to stop reading a book, I just frankly knew that this was not going to get any better for me. If you are someone who is able to look past a lot of these details, if you are not someone who really is sensitive to social injustices, if you are someone who's okay with reading incredibly disturbing and inappropriate and, all these things as a means of entertainment, I mean, you're probably going to like this book. And by all means, a lot of people do like this book. I feel like a lot of these reviewers said it right, but there's so many unfortunate aspects of this book that are just trapped in a lack of editing, in a time period where a lot of this stuff was rampant, and that ultimately I think that there is a really great story hidden inside of all these pages, but I think that we've already gotten that story extracted when it comes to the other media that's out there. I don't think I ever need to do anything other than just watch the movies again. So that's my opinion on it. My opinion doesn't cancel out your opinion. If you had a different experience of this book, you are correct for you. just like I'm correct with me. Feel free to add your perspective to the discussion in the comments below if you feel the same or otherwise. I still do plan to read more of Stephen King's books. I think I'm just going to stick more to the shorter books that are out there, and I'm just really, really hoping that I encounter more of his novels where the story itself is really what shines and not so much all of the problematic social aspects that Stephen King probably will never experience himself and should probably not be using, to sell his books. That's just my thought. When it comes to my next book, I'm actually going to kind of juggle two books, and I don't usually do that, but my next book is going to be House of Leaves by Mark Z. Danielewski. One funny comment that I got on my wheel video for March was that my wheel chose violence, and that is correct. So I have to read this book this month as well. But I also got the tip to read this book alongside another book, just, because it seems like this one takes a while. And I am so scared I might have another DNF video for you later. I'm really hoping not, but we'll see. And interspersed somewhere in there, and will probably end up being my next review, I'll probably finish this one first, but is Cloud Atlas by David Mitchell. Looking forward to that book. We'll see what happens. I'm really scared for the rest of my month. Oh well, if you did find any entertainment or anything of value out of this video, please consider giving it a like. Please consider subscribing if you want some more Book Squirrel in your life. And until next time, I hope you're having a wonderful whatever, and I'll talk to y'all later. Book Squirrel out. Bye. Da-da-da. Book Squirrel. I don't know.